Hello, I'm Ollie, and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, I want to talk about violence on the screen and on the page. So, probably as with many people who are horror fans, I've kind of been a bit swept up recently with the buzz around the film Terrifier 2. So, if you don't know, Terrifier 2 is a fairly low budget horror movie, which is very long, so it's like 2 hours, 20 minutes long. And it has been causing a bit of a stir on the internet recently because it's been released in cinemas in the US, and apparently it's people have found it so horrific that they've been passing out and vomiting in the cinemas, and ambulances have had to be called and things like that, which is the kind of buzz that any horror movie would die for. So I thought I would watch it. I watched the first film, Terrifier, first. So that came out a few years ago and was even lower budget. So Terrifier, the first one, was incredibly low budget. Terrifier 2 had, I think, about 7 or 8 times the budget of the first film. And what they're about is this clown who is a serial killer. And basically the films follow him going around slaughtering people. So the first one is very, very stripped down. In terms of it literally is just that, basically. There's not really much of a story, and there's very little character development with the characters in the book. Art, by the way, is the name of the clown. The second one is a lot richer. There's a lot more going on, and there's some I thought really good character work. So you've got kind of Art, doing his thing. But you've also got this kind of central family of a single mum, her kind of teenage daughter, and her younger son. And there's a fantastic, kind of dynamic between the different members of the family. The mum is kind of clearly at her wit's end a bit with her kids. The daughter is kind of building up to Halloween and has made this really elaborate Halloween costume for herself and wants to go out and celebrate Halloween. And the son is kind of obsessed with serial killers and things like that. And the mum is, distressed by that. And I thought that the relationship between those three characters was really well handled. And they do all go through, changes as the story progresses. But at its heart, this is a slasher movie, and Art is definitely the star of the film. And what these films are really about, I think, is a return to practical special effects. So many horror movies, and indeed all movies nowadays, are filled with CGI effects, which are can look absolutely fantastic. But lack, for me, as a fan of special effects, the kind of physicality of real old school practical special effects. And certainly when I was growing up in the 80s in particular, and into the 90s as well, the special effects artists in horror films were not household names, but for horror fans, they were as well known as the directors, and certainly better known than the writers. Nobody ever knows who the writer of a movie is unless it's someone stupidly famous. Quite often film fans will know who the directors are, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, everybody knew who Tom Savini was. Everybody knew who Rob Bottin was. People like that who contributed fantastic special effects to, some of the really big horror franchises and horror movies of the day. So it's great to see in the Terrifier films a return to that kind of real practical special effects. And the director, who's a guy called Damien Leone, actually does the special effects as well. And the special effects are really good. They are a little bit rubbery at times, but they're very effective. And he has, he clearly has a lot of fun with them. And that's the thing about these films, is they are incredibly graphic. So you see things done to people which are unimaginably horrible in these films. So they're definitely not films to watch if you have a weak stomach. They are very very violent. But they also have a kind of almost a sense of humour. The first film in particular reminded me a lot of the films of a director called Herschel Gordon-Lewis, who was one of the first makers of kind of gore films back in the 60s. So his first film was a film called Blood Feast, which is very well known. And the first Terrifier film definitely felt like that. It was very much focused on the horror and the gore, with the story being quite, just a bit of a wrapper around that. But as I say, the second film is A lot longer, but B pays a lot more attention to character building and things like that. And actually, I thought it was a really successful film as a result. It didn't feel to me like a 2 hour, 20-minute film. I really enjoyed watching it all the way through. And it got me thinking. It got me thinking about violence in books. And particularly about the extreme horror genre, because it seems to me that extreme horror is kind of the equivalent of this kind of movie. It's horror that goes out of its way to be graphic and shocking, and that's kind of really the point of it, is the explicitness of the violence in it. And this might be something that seems distasteful to people, and I know I've got there are a lot of people who watch this channel who aren't horror fans. But I think there's clearly there are a lot of horror lovers out there, and there is a definite appeal to watching that kind of really over the top, gross, explicit horror. But it's a hard one to explain. The fear one and that kind of adrenaline rush of fear, I think, is an easy thing to explain in terms of, and I've talked about this on the channel before, in terms of it kind of being a test for our fight or flight instincts. But the desire to see, really explicit violence, I think is something a bit different. And as I say, something that's a bit more difficult to tap into, or tap into the reasons for. But I think it's something about seeing how far you can push yourself. And certainly I think, with Terrifier 2, part of the buzz around it is that, do you dare to watch it? Are you strong enough to sit through this? But as I say, I think it's a film that's made largely with its tongue in its cheek, and it is having a good time with its gruesomeness. It's like that kind of thing that you get at Halloween, where people do will serve up things that look like eyeballs for people to eat. It's tapping into that kind of desire to see really disgusting things that I think is kind of human in a way, because if you can see, if you can imagine your body reduced to its component parts, completely taken apart, and you can walk away from that, then that in some ways is quite a liberating and cathartic thing. So I think the horror and the gore in Terrifier and Terrifier 2 is effective and dare I say entertaining for that kind of reason. But I do have a problem, and I've said this on the channel before. In fact, I've said it recently. I did a review of an extreme horror novel called Sick Bastards in the week just gone. I do think extreme horror books struggle with this a bit more. And I was thinking about why that is. And I read Sick Bastards because I was hoping it would be kind of similar in some ways to Terrifier 2. And it really wasn't. A book that I think is more similar to the Terrifier books is The Slob by Aaron Beauregard, which again is a very stripped down story. And most of it just revolves around scenes of torture and murder, basically. But I think the problem is that whereas something like Terrifier 2, so Terrifier 2 is incredibly gory. It's much gorier than most horror films. If you think about a lot of horror films, when someone is murdered, say someone gets stabbed, you see the knife go in, you see some blood spurt, and then, that's it. Whereas in Terrifier 2, you see that, and then you see it again and again and again, and you see, bodies dismembered and all that kind of thing. So it's definitely much more graphic. But still, that scene of someone being brutally killed, so being stabbed and dismembered or whatever, is still only going to take like 30 seconds, a minute. So in terms of the screen time, it's not that long, and in terms of the amount of time you have to endure it as a viewer, it's not that long. Whereas in extreme horror books, particularly I'm thinking of The Slob, these scenes go on for pages and pages and pages, and you have to, because you're reading it rather than just watching it, it takes more effort for you as a reader to kind of drag yourself through it. And I find as a reader that sort of extended description of violence in books gets very boring very quickly. In a movie like Terrifier 2, particularly because it's got practical special effects, there's something kind of interesting about it, because whilst you're watching it and whilst it's horrific, you're kind of also thinking, or I found myself thinking, how did they do this? What's the mechanism they've gone through to create this special effect? I find that kind of thing really fascinating, and always have. Even as a fairly young kid, I was really interested in special effects and how they were done. So I found myself watching, when I was watching Terrifier 2, thinking about, what they'd used to create these special effects. Whereas in a book, you just don't get that. So I think there's an additional layer to it that you don't get from extended descriptions of violence in books. And similarly, you can just turn away. So you can turn away from the screen and not lose track of what's happening. Whereas it's much more difficult in a book to flip through to the end of that scene and not miss something. So yeah, there's definitely that side to it. But I think the other side to it is, it feels to me like a lot of the extreme horror writers that are writing today are writing purely to shock and offend, and they are not necessarily the best of writers. Whereas someone like Damien Leone, or if you think back to films that were similarly shocking when they came out, so something like The Evil Dead, the Sam Raimi film. Sam Raimi is a really good filmmaker, and it's obvious he's a really good filmmaker, even in something extremely low budget, which is deliberately shocking and graphic, like The Evil Dead. He's clearly someone who understands filmmaking. And I think Damien Leone is a good filmmaker as well. I think there's a lot of, particularly in Terrifier 2, like the character building and things like that is really effective. And because of that, you care about the characters. I don't think I've ever cared about the character in an extreme horror novel. I've never felt sympathy for them particularly, because they're just words on a page. The authors, aren't necessarily skilled enough to make you feel something about those characters. And to really care about them, and because you don't care about them, the horror is less effective. Some of the horror in Terrifier 2 is really quite effective, because particularly towards the end, when it's like the final girl character who's being attacked, you do care about her. You've grown to care about her and the other members of her family, so it's much more effective as a result. And for me, that's really the important thing about horror, and about other forms of fiction as well, is building that relationship with the characters, so you actually care about them. And as I say, for me at least so far, most of the extreme horror writers I've read are not good enough writers to make you build up that relationship with the characters, so you actually care about what happens. Okay, time for a random book from the shelves. In line with the kind of theme of low-budget horror, I've got Bloodshow by Guy Smith for you today, which is a pretty bad horror novel, but it is quite enjoyably horrific at times. Guy Smith, definitely a pulpy writer, definitely not the most talented of writers, but his books can be quite fun. So I hope you found that interesting. If you're not a horror fan and you've made it this far, well done, and thank you for sticking with it. Even if you don't like horror, I hope you did find that interesting. Let me know what you think of extreme horror books. Let me know what you thought of Terrifier and Terrifier 2 if you've seen those movies. I have to say I really enjoyed them. They felt like a return to the kind of old school horror I really enjoyed in the 80s, albeit ramped up to 11. So if you want to connect with me and chat, then either leave a comment on the video, or you can find links to my social media accounts in the About section for the channel, as well as a link to my Discord server, where we talk about all sorts of bookish things. But yeah, as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.